Well, once again, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. Whether you're joining us here in person on Park Avenue or joining us online at stbarts.org, it is a joy and delight to have you with us. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and I am joined by my colleagues, the Reverend Meredith Ward and the Reverend Zach Niane, together here at the Forum, where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. We are delighted to welcome the Right Reverend Deon Johnson, Bishop of Missouri. And to more fully introduce and welcome our guest, I'm going to turn it over to our rector, the Right Reverend Dean Wolfe.
Well, good morning. I am so excited about this. Deon Johnson is one of the really bright new voices in the House of Bishops, and he's serving the Diocese of Missouri, which is in a collaborative partnership with the Diocese of Kansas and Western Missouri and Nebraska for the Bishop Kemper School for Ministry. He's doing all kinds of good work, and we're just very fortunate to have you here. And I hope you feel welcome, and hope your husband does too, Giovanni. We welcome you wherever you are. All right, that's my part.
Well, thank you, Dean. And we don't normally have more than two hosts for the Forum, but we thought that we would take the opportunity to highlight that there are 3 openly LGBTQ+ clergy on staff here at St. Bart's, and we thought we would all... And we thought on Pride Sunday, as we welcome Bishop Deon, we would highlight that by all being in conversation with him. So I hope it's not too overwhelming this morning. Bishop Deon, it really is wonderful to have you here, and you have a lovely sermon that I'm looking forward to hearing again.
Different version.
I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the experience of being the Bishop of Missouri. For so many reasons, you're not the type of person that most people would have expected to be the Bishop of Missouri.
Yes.
And yet you are. How surprised were you about that yourself? And what has it been like the last 3 years?
Yes. So I was elected in 2019, November 23rd. And the next day after my election, so I tend to talk with my feet, so I'll actually stand up. The next day, the Living Church wrote this article, and the opening line said, there have been gay bishops in the church before, LA, New York, Missouri. What? Missouri? So my election was a surprise to me as well, because when I got onto the slate to be one of the candidates for bishop, Giovanni and I, my husband, we said, oh, well, we'll go through this, we'll enjoy the great visit to St. Louis and see all the things in Missouri and go back home and continue doing what we've been doing. And so the day of the election, we were sitting at home. I was watching TV with our son, and I kind of had an iPad watching the live stream, but we were watching a movie. And my husband got a phone call from St. Louis, and don't tell him I said this, but my husband's phone is always at 2%. And it was the Bishop of Missouri calling, and I thought, oh, they're just calling to tell me, congratulations, you did not get elected, all the stuff that they do. And so Giovanni answers the phone, and the bishop says, is this Deon? And Giovanni says, no, this isn't him, but I can find him. And so he hands me the phone, and the Bishop of Missouri at the time said to me, congratulations, you have been elected. And the first words out of my mouth were, what? Because we did not expect that I was going to get elected in Missouri. And so the irony of the whole situation is that Missouri elected me as their bishop on the very first ballot. And that rarely happens in the church. But one of the things in Missouri is that the Episcopal Church in Missouri tends to be very progressive, and it's been the place that has led the way in many ways. So one of the things that I've learned since I've been there is that Missouri has been kind of a leader in pushing the church further forward in being its true self. For instance, back in the 1950s, the very first female delegate to General Convention came from Missouri. They elected her and sent her, and when she got there, they didn't know what to do with her. And I mean, they finally seated her and gave her a voice and vote. And then the next convention, we elected her, sent her back again. They said, no, that last time was a fluke. We won't have you again. But that's kind of what Missouri has been. We've been kind of pushing the church a little bit further forward. I had the great pleasure of being elected in November of 2019, and my consecration was supposed to be April of 2020. And you know what happened in early 2020. So my consecration got pushed from April to June. And so I was consecrated in our cathedral with 25 of my closest friends, with live streaming and the whole 9 yards. But it was a very interesting time to begin an Episcopal ministry, especially for someone like me who's a raging extrovert. It's really hard to have to talk to people behind a screen. But so far, post-COVID-ish, things have been going really well. We're getting into all kinds of really good trouble and stirring things up. So I will stop there.
Well, we are here on Pride weekend, and we talk a lot about Pride and LGBTQ Pride, but your diocese Pride theme this year is We Are Sorry.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about why it's important for us to say that in the midst of a Pride celebration.
There are lots of folks out there who are what I call church hurt. That they've been hurt by the church in so many ways. Whether they've been told that we can go through the list. You're going to go to hell. You're not. We love the sinner, hate the sin. All the things that you hear out there. And it's been my practice ever since I was a priest that at High Holy Days, so Christmas, Easter, when Grandma drags the grandkids to church with her, it's been my practice to say on the behalf of the church, if you have been hurt in any way, I apologize, and I hope that we could do better. And so our theme for this year is repentance, that we are repenting for the way that the church has hurt folks. And I have been very surprised by the reaction that we've been getting from those. So one of the things we did in the diocese is we sent yard signs that had that message on it to every congregation. And we had one congregation in a more conservative area where they put up the sign, it disappeared the next morning. They put up the sign, disappeared the next morning. And so we sent them a whole stack of signs and said, okay, we're going to... But the reaction overall has been extremely positive. And I'll tell you one brief story. One of my congregations that's in a very southern part, that tends to be a very conservative area, they, because of the sign, organized their very first Pride Fest on June 3rd. And they had the sign at their little booth. And they kept telling me there were people who kept coming up with tears in their eyes saying, do you all really mean that? Or taking pictures of the signs to say, are you really, is this really what you're really meaning? And we've had folks who have showed up at that church just to see if they really meant that everybody is welcome and that we are sorry for the hurt. So as I said, there's lots of church hurt people out there, and I think that the first way for us to begin to heal or to bridge that divide is to acknowledge that we are painted with the same brush as any other Christian. I mean, we may like to say sometimes or think that we are progressive, and we are, but for your average person out there, they hear church, and it's all of us. So I think the best way to begin healing is to acknowledge where we have caused hurt.
Well, Deon, you are such a bright and shining star in our church and such an icon of love and healing in the church and for the church. I personally lament that you were consecrated in 2020 because it means you haven't quite hit the 5-year mark that is required to be elected presiding
they got rid
bishop.
of that 5-year mark now.
Oh, wow.
Yes, but no, I'm not. No, no, thank you.
Would love to see you on the slate one of these days. If not next year, then maybe in 2023. But, it's been 20 years since Gene Robinson was consecrated. But there still aren't many openly LGBTQ+ bishops in the church. And in fact, at last year's gathering of bishops from all around the Anglican Communion at the Lambeth Conference, there were only 8 in our entire fellowship of churches. And so why do you think that LGBTQ+ bishops are still so rare? And what is it like still being one of the only ones in the Episcopal Church and wider communion?
Well, I'm not sure which part of that to tackle first. Well, so I'm one of, 4 here in the United States, or in the Episcopal Church, I should say. And a part of it is, I think, being able or willing to put yourself out there because the spotlight shines on you immediately. I mean, when I just got on the slate, forgot even being elected, that was a whole source of, lots of online conversation. And then when I was elected, there was lots of celebration, but there was also people who were adamantly opposed to me being consecrated the Bishop of Missouri. But I think a lot of it for our LGBTQIA+ clergy across the church, it is difficult to put your family and yourself through some of these processes. I was okay with them saying things about me because it's like, well, I signed up for this. My husband was okay with them saying things about him because he was like, well, I'm along for the ride. Don't tell him I said that. But when they started making comments about our children, that's when I turned into, forget a beer mom. You deal with the Caribbean dad. That's where I drew the line, that it was like, no, you can say whatever you want about me, but you get to say nothing about our kids. And I think for some of our LGBTQIA+ siblings, that I think is the barrier. Plus, I think the message has been out there for a very long time that we don't want you in these roles. We're still suffering from the residuals of what happened 20 years ago, or 20 plus years ago, with Gene Robinson's election, because that was a whole firestorm, and it almost prevented me from putting myself, because I thought, I don't want to go through all of that. And if I was elected in 2020, it meant I would be going to Lambeth. And Lambeth is its own weird bishop-like animal. That again shines another spotlight. I mean, I am the only person of African descent that's an out gay bishop in the Anglican Communion. So there's a lot that gets projected onto this lovely collar of mine just for being who I am. But the interesting or the good thing for me is I remind myself that I am just going to be me. That doesn't mean I'm going to conform to be what someone else expects me to be. And I think that would be the message I would give to our LGBTQIA+ siblings, is be fully who you are. And live into that in whatever process, which is being called to be rector, dean, priest, bishop, whatever, be authentically you. Because that's what I did when I went into this process. I mean, I literally said to myself, you're not going to elect me anyway, so I'm just going to be who I am and tell you what I actually think. And look where it got me. So I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Thank you. So Manhattan can be a bit of a bubble sometimes. You're in a purple to red state, and I wonder, this morning in your sermon you talked about kind of legislative attacks on LGBTQ+ rights.
Yep.
I wonder what you can say about kind of being this beacon for justice in a different context than the kind of elite Northeast coasts.
Well, I mean, to quote a phrase, the struggle is real. I have a missioner, so we have a bunch of different missioners across my diocese for different specific ministries. And so we had a missioner for LGBTQIA+ engagement, to engage with the diocese, but engage outside the diocese. Her name was Bren, and she's a trans woman. And she had to resign and move out of Missouri because of the anti-trans bill that was just recently passed. Our governor, in all of his great wisdom, called the legislature back from their recess to pass these draconian anti-trans health bills, both for kids and adults. And so that's kind of the waters that we're swimming in. We've just, as a diocese, joined with the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of St. Louis and a couple others to oppose the churches, guns in churches bill. So we have our state legislature just tried to pass that you can, carry guns in church. Well, the preacher says something in the sermon that they don't like. Well, I happen to have a gun, and so we joined with other faith traditions to oppose that. And I'm one of the 13 people suing the state of Missouri around the abortion ban, because Missouri has the most draconian ban on abortions right now in the country. And so myself and Tracy Blackman and a couple others, there are 13 of us that got together and decided that we would file suit against the state of Missouri because of what they did with and how they passed it. Missouri Constitution has this interesting clause that says you cannot have any preference for a faith tradition. And what our legislature did when they passed the anti-abortion bill is that they used Christian values to say, my Christian values forces me to oppose this, etc. And they codified that in the anti-abortion law. And so there's a bunch of religious folks that are saying, you just violated the clause of the Constitution, and not all of us are in that same, you can't say Christians do this, because not all of us are in agreement on that. It does make my job a lot more difficult in some ways, but it also makes my job a lot more joyful in other ways. I went to one of my more conservative congregations for my very first visit, and I thought, and Giovanni went with me, and I thought to myself, oh, this is going to be a fun Sunday morning. And this lady comes up to me, and she was, full rural congregation, so full camouflage because she's going hunting after church. And I mean, she's walking towards me, and I'm thinking in my head, oh, this is a great way to begin my morning. And she comes up and she just shakes my hand and says, I am so glad that you are here. My wife and I have been waiting forever for you to get here. And I just thought, okay, God, I got it. Thanks, message received. But that's the irony of Missouri, that we have this, this very conservative brand of Christianity, but we also have these folks who are just faithfully living out who they are in their context. I mean, she invited me to go hunting after church, and I was like, well, I'm kind of not dressed for that. So, but it's that kind of keeps me doing what I'm doing in Missouri. My grandmother, in her wisdom, would say, to be successful in life, you have to do three things: get up, dress up, and show up. And on most Sundays, that's what I do. I get up, I dress up, and I show up. And we are an incarnational people. And so it's much more difficult to have a conversation that's anti-LGBTQIA+ when one of us is standing in that room in the conversation. So showing up is kind of what I do in the show me state.
It's really wonderful to hear how you've been welcomed at parishes in your diocese. And here at St. Bart's, we talk a lot about radical welcome. It's sort of our motto, our mission here. How do you think we can better live into our aspirations of welcome?
Well, one of the things that I've said a lot to our congregations in Missouri is I don't want places that welcome. Welcoming is a low bar. I mean, name a church that doesn't say that they're welcoming. Your most conservative, closed church will say, well, we are welcoming. And so I've said, I don't want congregations that are welcoming. Welcoming is a low bar. Welcoming is turning on the lights, opening the door, and saying, y'all come. What I have said is I want our church to be a place of hospitality. And hospitality is a whole lot different than welcome. Hospitality is the tablecloths, and it is going out of your way to say to someone else, you have a place here if you choose to take that place. And so for us as Episcopalians, and I mean even here at St. Bart's, I think we need to lean much more into what it means to be hospitable. And like with our campaign for this Pride Month, hospitality begins by acknowledging where we have gone wrong. And saying, we've messed up along the way. Here's a way that we are looking, with your help, to do and be better. So it's offering both the repentance and help us change. And so a lot of that, I spend a lot of my time just asking questions of marginalized folks who have been pushed to the side. Some of the best conversations I have are with people who want nothing to do with the church, that I will meet at some public forum or some public event, and just have conversation with them and begin by saying, I'm sorry that you were hurt. What could we as a church do to make this a place of welcome for you? And that's been really, really helpful to me in my ministry. And I think it's been helpful to the Diocese of Missouri because I reflect that back to the diocese to say, here are the things that I'm hearing from our young people, from people who are not in church, from people who want nothing to do with the church. How can you, in your place, become a place of holy hospitality that invites them as if you were inviting Jesus himself?
Well, aside from gun violence and abortion and all of these controversial issues of the day, way back before COVID, you and I, Deon, served on perhaps the most controversial group possible for Episcopalians, which was the Task Force for Prayer Book Revision. More recently, in addition to your service ongoing in the House of Bishops, you were elected with our own Tavon Cooper to the Episcopal Church's Executive Council. And so as someone who is really shaping the future of the church, how do you envision the future of our dear Episcopal Church? What do you see changing? What are we going to hold on to? What does God have in mind for us?
Easy question, huh? Well, see, one of the things that I've said when I was a parish priest, my parish, we were getting ready to do some big things and make some changes. And I had a sign made that quoted General Shemsiki that said, if you don't like change, you're going to like being irrelevant even less. And I've passed that on to my diocese. If you don't like change, you're going to like being irrelevant even less. The reality is, for us as a church, we have to change. And I don't mean, because whenever I say that, folks begin to cringe like, are you going to mess with my prayer book? And that's not what I mean. I mean that we have to re-engage and rediscover what it means to be a people who are good news in a world that often is bad news. It means we have to rediscover what it really means to be evangelists, to actually do the work of evangelism. And we have a skewed understanding of what evangelism is supposed to be. I mean, most of us think that this is evangelism. If you don't mind me using you, Marshall, have you found Jesus?
I think so.
I always go, I didn't know he was missing. Or have you accepted him as your personal Lord and Savior? And it's just kind of like, what kind of question is that? I call that spiritual bullying. I mean, nobody's going to no one's going to decide to come to faith because of somebody threatening them. I mean, I saw a sign as I was driving to one of my visitations not too long ago in a rural area that said, where are you going to spend eternity, smoking or non-smoking? I just thought, no. So it means we have to rediscover what it means to be a church that is centered on sharing and being good news. And most of the time, we don't think of ourselves as having good news. But when you think about what we say and do in church on Sunday mornings, I can't think of anything else that would be even more radical good news in a world where you turn on the TV or go on social media and it's all bad. I mean, think about riffing off of our gospel from this morning, there's that line that says, I know every hair on your head. You are of more value than many sparrows. Most of the time it's just kind of a throwaway line, but think about who needs to hear that message. Think about what it looks like if we reoriented ourselves to be good news, to be gospel out in the world. Because most of the time, the Jesus that people are going to encounter, the gospel that people are going to read, and the good news that people are going to find isn't going to be in this building. It's going to be you. It's going to be you and I in the frozen peas aisles of Save-A-Lot or something. It's when we're out in the world encountering people that we get the opportunity, and I really mean the opportunity, to say to folks, you are loved beyond measure by a God who calls you beloved. I think that that's what our world, our society, our community is longing for. And we can't wait. I mean, there are two things I've been saying in the diocese. Jesus will come again. The 1950s won't. Because, I mean, that's the thing. If we just get this right, we'll be just like how we were in the 1950s. And it's like, no. Jesus is going to come again. The 1950s will not. But we also get the opportunity to go out and share and be good news. And if we aren't energized when someone sends us out from the church and say, go in peace to love and serve the Lord, if we're not energized to go out and be that radical welcome, my fear is that we won't have a church in 20 years. When I was ordained, I mean, I've shared this in our diocese, when I was ordained 20 years ago last week, there were 2.7 million Episcopalians. Today, there's 1.7 million Episcopalians. We have lost 1 million Episcopalians in 20 years. This is telling me in 20 years, there's 700,000 Episcopalians, and in 30 years, there'd be no Episcopalians. I don't believe that. I do believe that before there's resurrection, we have to experience Good Friday. The problem with Good Friday is that we don't want to have a Good Friday. But that's all throughout our gospel. You know, Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. You know, and branches, I mean, it sounds good for having a pruning until you're the one being pruned. And I think that this is a pruning for us as a church. And what comes after pruning is growth when we actually reorient ourselves to who we have been and whose we are. If we're not centered on Jesus like the disciples, we're sinking. And my thinking is that we've taken the emphasis off the wrong syllable. Because we've taken our eyes off of following this Jesus that really radically transformed lives. The other piece that I would add to that is that we have, for the longest time, not allowed for good faith formation for everyone. To me, that's the biggest crisis in the church right now, that we don't have a good understanding of who it means to be an Episcopalian, and why does that make a difference, and why is Jesus important to us? I mean, one of the questions I ask everyone going through our ordination process, priests coming into my diocese, I ask the question, you got 30 seconds, who's Jesus and why is he important to you? And most of the time I get a very theological, by-the-book answer. And some of the best ones I get every once in a while is, Jesus is the one who said to me when everybody else said that I was terrible or awful or something like that, Jesus is the one who said to me I was enough. That's someone I know that can go out and tell the good news from their brokenness. Because we tend to be in the Episcopal Church, we like to have it all together. And I don't know about you, but most days I get out of bed and it's like, Lord, just get me through this day. Because my life is just as messy as everybody else, but we like to put a good veneer on sometimes. And the reality is there are folks out there carrying lots of hurts. And if we can't walk alongside them in that hurt, in that pain, then we're doing them and us a disservice. So I'm hopeful for the future of the Episcopal Church if we radically reorient ourselves on hospitality, being centered once again on being spreaders of the good news, and being centered on Jesus.
We have a few minutes for your questions for Bishop Deon. Conrad Tinney, I believe, has question cards. If you raise your hand, he'll pass one to you, and then he'll get them up here to Meredith and Zach. If you're joining us online, you can enter your question into the live chat on YouTube, into the comments on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson@stbarts.org. And email works if you're in the building too. While we're waiting for those questions, I had a chance to listen to your podcast yesterday. It's 11 in 11, right?
Yep.
And I was particularly struck by the Juneteenth episode. It's sort of become its own liturgical season here at the end of June. We have now Juneteenth Sunday, followed by Pride Sunday, followed by Independence Day. Three kind of different ways of looking at issues of freedom. And I'm wondering if you can talk about those connections a little more.
I find it it's not a coincidence to me that Juneteenth and Pride Month fall together. Juneteenth is the celebration of the news of emancipation finally making it to Galveston Harbor, Texas, after many, many moons. And for the African American population, that was actually Emancipation or Independence Day. So that's why it's Juneteenth Freedom Day is the official name. But I wrote an article where I put that celebration of Juneteenth together with what Marsha P. Johnson did here in Stonewall, because it has been, in many places, people of color who have pushed this society to be better and who often don't get credit for it. You know, Marsha P. Johnson was one of the pioneering people who got Pride and, LGBTQ rights and all of that stuff brought to the fore. But up until recently, she got no credit for kind of doing that stuff. And just like Juneteenth, a lot of the Union soldiers, the regiments that proclaimed this Emancipation Proclamation were black regiments. And so that often gets lost. So for me, joining the two, seeing that struggle for freedom, the struggle for equality with the LGBTQIA plus struggle, it's one and the same. Because we tend to try to divide, and there's always intersectionality between all of these different movements. Women's movements, LGBTQIA plus movement, the civil rights movement, all of this was all swirling around together. And we managed to, as a society, try to separate all of these different pieces, because if they're separate, they can't unite to be one voice. And so for me, there is deep wisdom in Juneteenth and Pride Month being together, because it is always looking towards the dream that America is. Always to making that where we all are truly and fully equal and one.
Well, we'll let Meredith read the question first. We have one submitted online already.
Okay.
Someone mentions the rise of the nuns and asks, what works to grow the church, and is that our goal?
Yeah. So Jesus at the end of Matthew's Gospel, the 25th chapter, says, "Go therefore into the world and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son." I mean, we've heard that great commission. He didn't say, "Go therefore and make Episcopalians." I wish he did, but no. He said, "Go make disciples." What are disciples? Disciples are simply people who follow what Jesus has been doing. Growing the church is not our goal. It's not our job. I've said to because I get that question in my diocese a lot, and I say to the diocese, is like, look, that is above your pay grade. You can't, a farmer doesn't go out into a field, plant seeds, and go, "Come on, grow." They water it, and they are patient. Right now, Christianity, with a big C, has a PR problem. Barna, back in 2017, did a survey, and it found that when you ask millennials, when they hear the word Christian, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Self-righteous was number one. Homophobic was number two. Now think about what those two mean. Number one was self-righteous, number two was homophobic. What didn't make that list in anywhere? Loving, joyful, or hopeful. Didn't even come close to the list. So it means that we have a PR problem. What I have said, the way that we continue to encourage people to be a part of faith communities is by simply being who you were called to be, a place of holy hospitality. I am not worried about whether someone's going to walk in the door of the church or not. I'm more worried about us being faithful to being our call as followers of Jesus. They'll know we are Christians by our love. And that is not what's out there. So part of what I think that we as a church are called to do, especially with millennials and with those other, with the different generations, is to be beacons of radical love. If we can't do that, we're wasting our time. Jesus said to us, you are the light of the world. Well, what happens? You're drawn to a light. You're not necessarily forced to a light. And I think that if we continue to be or take on that mantle of being lights in our communities, both individually and as faith communities together, that we won't have to worry about the church. We have a new church plant in my diocese. It's called The Journey. And the priest there, she literally went out and picked people up off of the street and took them to rehab facilities and all that stuff. It is the church, we call it the Church of the Misfits, because it has people who are incarcerated. It has people who can't read. It has people who are in drug rehab. I mean, there are all of these people. She's only been doing this for less than a year. There's about 40 people who show up at that place every single week. And most of them had said, I want nothing to do with church. Why are they showing up? Because she, in her ministry, is reminding them, and herself, I think, that God loves you. If she's willing to pick people up off the street, I mean, one of the people joined the church because they saw her pick a guy off the street and take him back to the rehab facility, and said, well, if that's what church is like, I want to be part of that. So it's doing those things that Jesus told us to do. Take care of the sick, be with those who are hurt, visit people in prison, do the things that we know we've been called to do. God will grow the church. That's God's job, not ours.
Walking with people on their faith journey, being who God calls us to be. We have a question from someone, and this is a big question, but wondering if you could share a little bit about your personal faith journey.
Well, my faith was shaped a lot by my grandmother. I quote her often and a lot. My grandmother was this font of wisdom, both practical and not so practical. I mean, she would say things like, be you, everybody else is taken. But she would also say, remember to lotion between your toes. So she was this very radical, But my grandmother was the first generation of my family who was not enslaved. So her parents started off in slavery, and so she did not have a long education, but she knew how to read her Bible, and she knew how to read her prayer book. And one of the formative pieces for my faith when I was growing up, she had a brother, my Uncle Tunny, who she'd been taking care of him for a while, and she couldn't anymore. She physically could not take care of him, and so she had to put him in the equivalent of a nursing home. We don't have nursing homes in Barbados, but it's kind of the equivalent. And about 2 weeks after he had been there, he died. And she was mad because she had wanted to be with him through this final journey, and she didn't get that chance. And so at the funeral, when everything was done, my grandmother was walking through the cemetery from the grave site back to wherever people were, and she was letting God have it, both barrels. I mean, she said some things some words that I didn't even know my grandmother knew those words. And she was mad, but she went home that night, took out her Book of Common Prayer and took out her Bible and said her prayers as normal. And what it taught me at a very young age is that you can be mad at God. You can have those times in your life where you just do not, like, God, you and I are just not on speaking terms right now. And that's okay. She gave me permission to actually have a relationship with God that wasn't, okay, I'm fearful. It was I don't want to make the leap to friend, but, I have a deep, intimate relationship with you, and I can be mad. And there have been times in my life where I couldn't pray. Early in my ordained ministry, my young nephew, who had been born, died at 8 days after he was born. It was devastating to my family. And I got the news one of the Sundays that I was preaching just before church started. And I went into the pulpit and I said to the congregation, I can't do it this morning. I just can't. I just got the news that my nephew has died. And right now, God and I cannot figure out how to square this. And that community afterwards, there was a line of people who came up to, comfort, to say things to me. But most of what they were saying is, I lost a child. I lost this. But a group of those folks said to me, we know that you can't pray right now. So we are going to pray your prayers in your stead. So they prayed me through all of that hard time until the relationship with God got back. And so I think that for me, those have been the formative parts throughout my faith journey, that it's not always been fun and easy. It's been hard, but when I can't, others can. And that we can continue to have that deep relationship with a God who's just never going to let us go, as annoying as that can be sometimes.
What gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Our young people, and our older folks as well. The church as a whole gives me hope when we get it right. And what do I mean by that? When we really discover who we are and whose we are, and the joy that comes with knowing who we are and whose we are our best selves. And seeing, like in my diocese, seeing our young people take the mantle and say, you know what, we're going to lead this church where it needs to go. And seeing some of our senior saints kind of going, you know what, I'm going to step out of the way so that you can have your time in the spotlight. And I'll be wisdom and advice as you need it. So those two ends, both our young people and our senior saints, are the ones who tend to give me the most hope, because they tend to be the ones who are willing to make the change. It's us in the middle who tends to kind of go, don't move anything. But those two groups, for me, seem to be where God is doing the most movement.
A little later today, weather permitting, we're going to join the march and walk down the streets of Manhattan proclaiming Pride. Can you talk about why Pride is so important?
Well, when you think, like 50 years ago was when the Stonewall riots happened. 50 years, that's what, a generation, barely a generation. And 50 years ago, I wouldn't have been even possible for many reasons. But I wouldn't have been a priest, I wouldn't have been a bishop. We've come, both as a church and a society, a long way. Now, think about this. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when George Bush was still president, we were talking about a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage, right? In 2015, our decently conservative Supreme Court declared marriage to be a thing, and last year, our very conservative Congress passed a marriage act that codified gay marriage. That's happened in less than 50 years, or in 50 years. What I think Pride is a celebration of the protests that started us, and the progress that we have made, and hopeful looking towards the future where we are called to go. So I think it really is a celebration of the past, of those giants like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and all of those Stonewall folks. It's Harvey Milk and all the people who came after that. And it's looking towards another generation that we're saying, hopefully in the future, those struggles won't be yours. So I think that's Pride is wrapped up in all of that.
Bishop Deon, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And he's not done with us yet. We hope you'll stay around for the 11 a.m. service. Bishop Deon will be preaching, and we'll have a great celebration. So please do stay on, whether you're joining us here in person or online, and we hope you'll be back for the forum next week.
Well, thank you. Oh, should probably turn off my mic.